really kind of getting back to basics here in this marketing role, looking at the Celtra brand and diagnosing the brand, being able to build strategies for the brand and do some real marketing. It's really fun. I'm excited to talk to you today, Brad, about creative excellence, staying on brand in the digital age, and a number of other topics. Maybe you can just give a quick introduction to yourself for the audience.
Sure. Yeah, and so I'm Brad. Hi, nice to see everyone. I currently am the global head of global brand creative and design at MetLife, and I've been at MetLife for about 4 years. My responsibility is basically to drive our brand and brand expression forward across all of our channels, both on and offline, and both internally and externally. And I've been at MetLife for about 4 years now. Prior to that, I was exclusively agency side. I worked in a number of ad agencies, branding agencies, digital shops, small boutiques, you name it. And so that's me. I also just wanted to say thanks for having me, and just give a shout out to both Brand Innovators and actually Michelle Fro, who's a colleague of mine at MetLife, who got me into Brand Innovators right before the pandemic. And I got to say, throughout the past almost, I guess, coming up on 2 years soon, it's just been a great way to stay connected while we've all been kind of isolated and doing our work from home thing. So I just wanted to say thanks to you guys for having me and letting me be a part of this.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you to Brand Innovators. It has been a great resource, and it's hard to believe it's coming on 2 years, right?
Yeah.
In our conversations leading up to this, we talked about what is creative transformation and kind of big transformation initiatives. And one of the topics that kept coming up was the idea of the fundamentals, or getting back to the basics. And I think that that's a good starting point for us in terms of just what does that mean. When you're looking at big initiatives, you've launched a number of big initiatives already at MetLife. What are your thoughts on what are the basics? How do you get back to them? And take us through your thinking there.
Sure. I mean, I'm a true believer in the fundamentals, and I hate to use a sports analogy because it's so sort of trite in the business world, but I think it might be helpful. I mean, there's a quote from Vince Lombardi that said, "Fundamentals win championships," and he would start, I think, his training season by telling his very accomplished teams, "This is a football." I think, in addition, another one of my sports heroes, I guess, would be Phil Jackson, coach of the Michael Jordan era Bulls and Lakers, and he had this back to basics sort of mentality and approach, which for a lot of his players, I think was a bit shocking. He would do things like, during practice, have players practice without the ball, and just work on, their sort of spacing on the court, that sort of thing. But even outside of sports, and I'll get to how this applies to creative in a minute, but I think, even things like yoga, right? I'm not an expert in yoga, but there are many different types of yoga, right? You have Bikram yoga, you have Vinyasa yoga, you have power yoga. I think you can even have a goat stand on you while you do yoga these days. But the fundamental to yoga is breathing and your core, right? That doesn't change. So I think that when we look at creative, I think we as marketers can sometimes get hung up on the many different types of outputs or destinations where your creative might live or end up. But the fundamentals, in my opinion, don't change. And so I think when you look at, um, creative, is it rooted in a true insight? Does it make you stop and think? Is it unexpected? When you look at design, there's certain rules about design around aesthetics and beauty that have been studied for, centuries by the great philosophers. These fundamentals around harmony, balance, these type of things do not change. So I'm sure we'll hit on it a little bit later in our talk, but the idea of canvases, or spaces where creative might show up, right? You think of a social post, or a mobile screen, or a television screen, something out of home, an environment, an app, whatever. These are, in my mind, analogous to the many different types of yoga, but the creative that lives within them, uh, will always be rooted in those fundamentals, if they're to be good. So that's kind of how.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, maybe we just drill into that, right? So the essence, the breath of creative. What in your mind, are there building blocks to that? I mean, obviously there's the years of design work and thinking on this. There's the insight, or the ability to get the insight in the process to do that. But what do you see as sort of the building blocks of an elements for yourself? And then, how do you, and then we can get into maybe how you use those to get towards creative excellence.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some things, like I was mentioning before, around, you know, harmony, balance, aesthetics, the more of a tactical, when you get into the, the making of creative assets or expressions. I think, though, what I see happening more, these days, when you think about the traditional building blocks of a brand and how those are created, developed, and distributed, you're often looking at what we would call like a traditional brand guidelines. And this would be your identity system, all the photography, illustrations, graphics, colors, typography, all those things that um, traditionally have been used to build a brand. I think, as if we look through the lens of creative transformation, these building blocks have to become more modular and more adaptive, and you have to demonstrate through whatever guidelines you publish about, your brand system. You have to demonstrate how those assets flex across, not just traditional media, but digital media as well, and digital expressions as well. And I think, you and I had been talking last week a bit. You showed me some examples of, some of the work you're doing at Celtra, which I found very fascinating, because it I think, oftentimes, when we have these discussions with our partners, it's hard to imagine what we mean by that, like, how a brand could adapt to a social asset, let's say. Um, but there are so many creative and interesting ways that you can think about color and background and photography, and um, how those assets become modular and create variants of themselves to meet um, the overwhelming demand for creative output and expression that exists today.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. I think that yeah, this movement towards modularity, right? Building blocks, moving towards a more modular system, uh, and then trying to carry that essence through, right? So how can you build and shape the the tactical execution of the idea in a way that carries that through and carries essence through, and can you doing that just in one place is hard enough, right? But can you actually then build systems and guidelines leveled up from sort of the brand guidelines of the past that enable global teams to implement at that level? I have a couple of those examples that you're talking about. Maybe I should just share those just for a second to, um, let me just see if I can do this 1 second. Um, so Brad and I were going through, we were discussing this exact idea. And so we just put together a couple slides to just give examples. Can you see my screen, Brad?
Yes.
Okay. I won't go full screen. I'll just simply click through. But Brad talked about a social post. Imagine a social ad for a brand's product. And here's an example of our guidelines being kept. Is there any branding being carried through? Is there a story being told? Is the essence of whatever that original idea? Is there the product itself is the hero? It is the only thing there, right? And if your product is a big enough brand and it's well branded, maybe you're telling a little bit of a story there. But really, how are you using your building blocks in this instance? So this idea of just simply applying consistent branding into those kinds of channels, for example, with here's Yeti taking an on-brand color that matches the product hero and adding a logo to create a much better experience. Just as another example, here's a range of products that would normally show up on white in a social post. Now you're seeing them with an on-brand selection of colors that could be, built in an automated way, or you could have a set of reference system that it's calling to, and allow those stories to be told, right, in a more granular way. And then what Brad spoke about too, having building blocks that can be carried forward. Like, what about this idea of really taking the top of the funnel stories and moving them through a little bit better, and giving yourself more building blocks to build with for those moments? Here's an example of more consideration or upper funnel storytelling that a brand is doing. They've got imagery that's part of the campaign where they're trying to tell a certain kind of story and give a kind of feel. There's an insight there that's driving it. And then they're able to take that through now, again, matching with on-brand colors, matching across a product catalog, creating a much richer experience. So not only is that instance, does it feel different to that consumer, but it actually can marry that feeling that they might have experienced in other places. So as a storyteller, you're giving you've got a bigger breadth, essentially a bigger way to take that essence and make sure it manifests across different places.
Yeah, and I love, I mean, this is so inspiring for me to just see the before and after of this, because this is a perfect example of the sort of instances that I think, when you look at a traditional brand guidelines or system, these aren't considered until later, right? Like it's a very top down sort of exercise of building a brand, and then it's widely distributed, and then you have teams, product design teams, content teams, all sorts of different creative and design teams who are using this document as a guidance, and then often they have to guess and figure out on the fly, okay, how does this apply to what I'm doing? And I think it's necessary for all brands to consider, how the brand is expressed all the way at the top of the funnel, all the way through down, because those lower funnel touches are arguably becoming more important than the upper funnel. Yeah, so I think that's a really a really cool example that you just showed.
Yeah, thanks. We've actually seen some stats that show because lower funnel, there's a high frequency of them against your audience because they're as they've been self-identified, right, as showing interest in a product through some mechanism, whether they are on a shopping cart or whatever it is. And so now there's some performance marketers kind of drilling in, trying to make sure they convert. And we've seen some studies that show up to 85% of your brand's impressions with your audience can be in these performance ads. And whether you knew that or not, that can be what's happening. And yes, it's a huge risk to yourself as a brand. I think, Brad, the point you brought up about the you don't think about it until later. Like you're here. I am in the world. I've got to activate something. I've got, on one hand, it could be a CRM plan, a media plan, whatever it is. On the other hand, I've got guidelines, and then I've got a set of assets I'm working with. And is there how do you think about bringing that information back upstream, right? How do you take the sort of context or the behaviors that might exist and start to think about, enable them to be thought about earlier in the process or as part of guidelines or for the teams that might be activating against them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of times we discover these new problems, after the fact, and we have to do some backtracking to make sure that we can solve for it correctly. I mean, I give you one example. We create a lot of apps at MetLife, and a lot of them are internal and some are external. We're starting to create more external as we continue on our digital transformation. The app ecosystem, the naming conventions, the iconography, how it shows up in the app store, it has not been considered, right? It's not, there's no guidelines right now about how to deal with that. So we are forced, in a good way, to think about how we can flex our brand to adapt to that different environment. And I think, I don't know what the answer is in terms of how we start to influence, these sorts of behaviors or activities or goals from the beginning. But clearly, it has to. In my mind, I think if you're, I think we need to get better at anticipating the different types of environments or outputs or canvases or spaces where the brand is going to live, and include that in that enterprise level top down guidance. I mean, I think, again, traditionally you might see, oh, okay, here's your brand, here's your identity system, here's how it, here are the building blocks, here's how it applies to an ad, here's how it applies to a t-shirt, here's how it applies to, an out of home. And these are more traditional, um, uh, landing places for where the brand might show up. But I just think it's as simple as we have to evolve as an industry to start thinking about those things sooner,
Yeah,
earlier.
that's a fantastic point. I mean, it's one thing to have sort of best practices of a channel, but what you're pointing to is the aggregated effects of transformation initiatives end up creating this larger set of challenges. And there isn't a preview button for your transformation initiative. There's no way to say, okay, we're going to build. There's some challenge you have, some initiative is kicked into motion. You work towards solving a set of, and you stagger it because it's gigantic, and meanwhile you're starting to make an impact. The impact creates new problems that are unthought, have not been fleshed out yet.
Yeah.
Maybe we use that as a stepping point. So I ran into on social, what I've now heard is called the Digital Brand Project, which was the launch of digital.metlife.com. I ran into it through, I believe, one of the creative design leads who might have worked on it, from one of the agencies that worked on it. It was a really exciting project. I looked at it. Yeah, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about that as one of your transformation projects, your creative transformation projects, about how you're trying to keep MetLife on brand in the digital age.
Yeah, that was a super exciting project to work on. Just want to caveat by saying it was a huge group across many disciplines at MetLife, and was an honor to be a part of it. I think, yeah, just going back to what we were just discussing around what you anticipate and where you anticipate your brand showing up. Um, you know, we didn't necessarily consider that when we launched our brand back in 2016 beyond the traditional channels, right? So um, MetLife matured. I've been there for 4 years. We've come a long way in terms of our digital transformation, our experience design practice, how we uh, run design sprints, how we do design thinking, how we even run agile teams within our group. We've come a long way. Still a long way to go, but plenty of work done there. I think we got to a point in our maturity where um, we had to say, okay, how should the brand show up within our digital ecosystem? So that's, if we're launching a new app, or if we're revamping a homepage in Japan, um, uh, whatever. And the reason why it came up was we were doing those activities, but doing it in what I would say, like, focus more on the functionality, right? We're focused on, if we're revamping the a web a homepage in X market. We want to make sure it works. We want to make sure it functions. We want to make sure that the customer can log in, that they can do what they need to do and get out. Um, and that definitely is, I think that led the charge in terms of how we were transforming. As we matured, I think we started to say, but wait a minute, we've done a lot of work around not only building our brand at the center and at an enterprise level, but also localizing our brand across our key markets. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to leverage those assets within those digital spaces. Now, once you get to those digital spaces, it's harder to wrap your head around, where does the brand fit in, right? Because even in your examples, right, like, those are social posts. Really, when you break it down, it's the background, right? Like, that's the space that you can add a brand signal, right? Which I think, in our discussions, we both agree adds a ton of value compared to the one on the left that was on a white background, right? Um, it's very difficult to one, wrap your head around, and two, identify the areas within, let's say, a website that can be branded. And and then as you drill down deeper, there is the idea of branding a surface, which could feel like an ornament or a wallpaper, right? Or there's the idea of, I would say, the more conceptual approach to how brand and storytelling and content all kind of work together to enrich an online experience and actually add to, um, usability, seamlessness, satisfaction, when you start to get into the UI elements. And I could go on and on, but you could also start to think about those spaces as, marketing spaces, where the canvas gets a little bit bigger and more flexible. That could be, a homepage hero component, right? That's like a big space activate your brand. Or when you get into more servicing moments, right? Like we have a find a dentist sort of servicing platform within MetLife.com. We started to ask ourselves, why can't, or how can the brand play a role even in this very service function led part of the site. So again, I could kind of go on and on.
Yeah, yeah, it's fantastic. It's a massive project, and I really recommend people take a look. Digital.metlife.com, and it lays out a number of pillars of what Brad is talking about, and gives a bunch of tools and mechanisms that people can be enabled by, and in a lot of different contexts, like you're saying, marketing, service development, app development, etc. I think it's really broad, and it's a huge transformation initiative. Maybe, well, some interesting challenges that I think come out of that are this idea of staying on brand, and how do you keep consistency, and how do you police it is the wrong word, but really, all this effort goes in. This is how things ought to be. Here's some guidance and some rules, and then there's actual implementation in a specific market. And I think on one side is just the policing of brand guardianship and that side of it. The other is sort of the transcreation, right? The localize the effort that someone's going to make their message work. And how do you go about supporting it from this global hub?
Yeah, this is the $1 million question. Anyone who's ever worked in a global capacity would probably commiserate with me how hard it is to enable a team outside of your own with the tools and assets and resources to go make and let them do the good work they're going to do um, without creating too many guardrails. At the same time, managing that consistency and excellence. It's very difficult. I will say, like, if my agency, my ex agency folks are watching this and hearing me out here, I think like a lot of it is incumbent on the agency partners that we work with to not just take all these guidance and tools and so forth and interpret them literally, but to find the sweet spot between the literal interpretation and the going way too far out of bounds into a different universe place, and help push us um, to build off of we have what we've published, and to create the thread uh, um, that connects the original to the new. I to be completely honest, and maybe I was a bit cavalier when I was younger and agency side, but when someone would give me a 200 page brand guidelines, so I would just kind of like push it to the side and say, all right, I get it, or flip through it really quickly, get it, okay, let's see where we can kind of take this to the next level. So I think that's part of it, right? Part of it is really encouraging our agency partners to push, but there are inherent problems in that too, right? But budget, talent, um, it's not an easy solve. We've also, I think the other side, when you get into the real governance and management side of it in house, we've tried many different ways of doing it, and there's no right answer. There's no right answer. I think so much of it comes down to you know creating an environment. I mean, this is going to sound cliche when I say it, but it's you know it, allowing your partners across your teams feel like they have ownership over the work, that they help create it, that their input is recognized, that they feel invested in what you've done and what you've created together, and understand where, like, the push and pull between what's in and out of bounds. Again, not easy to do, but I've found every time I've tried to helicopter in and shut down a program and say, we're starting from scratch, this is all wrong, that sometimes it works, but most times it doesn't create the sort of relationship that builds good brand and good brand stewardship. You really have to do it together, I think.
I think that's great, Bad. You in both previously this idea of, when you played out the effects of the app ecosystem, right? You built out all these digital apps. Now there's this new problem: naming conventions, the icon. There's no architecture that actually, the brand architecture of your app ecosystem, however you want to call it. Here is another sort of ripple effect you're describing, right? You've got the push and pull, and I think that's an area, that sweet spot in between literal interpretation of an idea and then that different universe. Um, it's almost like you're advocating for, or maybe we're just ideating on it, this idea that you could have as part of, number one, enablement for the teams, right? And that co-investment somehow that they're feeling in. It's their project, their work, their brand. They understand, and they've got to be enabled. They have to be on the same page from the guidelines. Number one. Number two, sounds like there's this modularity to what you're doing. If things are built the right way, they can be modular, and you can carry that essence through into different channels. But then, what are they saying, or what are they actually doing in those channels? Here's that push pull you're talking about, through agency partners, perhaps giving them a chance. Is it something where you can imagine that as part of the brand guidelines, it's almost like a story guidelines, and you have instances of how creative is played out from that literal example to an extreme, and maybe it's even contextualized to a country. Like you have, here for again, Spain. This is one side and this is the other, and you've worked with maybe a Spanish agency, to help get there. Have you tried ever, playing that localization through? Is that something you've ever worked on as part of these bigger projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to. I mean, that's kind of what I was getting, towards around adaptability and the new way of thinking about brand. Because if we think about it just as a set of literal building blocks and assets that people can make their own work off of, it's too short-sighted of an outlook. I think we have to start thinking about storytelling as a compendium to the design system, that content, um, different content modes, different topics. I think that kind of goes hand in hand with tone of voice as well. That's the often, like, what I've experienced is the most overlooked type of guidance that you can give. But I think if we can start to address the different types of storytelling modes and expressions that a brand either already is doing or wants to do or aspires to do, I think that is I think that's just going to help the cause overall. I think one thing we got to be careful of is you can't boil the ocean. You can't cover everything. You have to leave room for your agency partners and the creative folks who are hungry to do great work. If you don't give them the space to figure out on their own what could be an even better story or even better concept or campaign, um, you're going to box them in. And they're going to give you a literal interpretation of what you've created.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, when I worked at RGA, Nick Law used to say, because I was building out the comms planning practice, and he looked at what I was helping build out as, help us figure out the sphere that all the innovative ideas should happen within.
Mm,
It's like if you don't have the sphere, it could be everywhere.
yeah,
But if you can show, within here, anything is possible, and it's still gigantic once you're inside of the sphere. You feel like it's a whole world.
yeah.
But yeah, it's that same principles. So I think we're at time for asking questions. I don't. Great. We got. Hi, Brad. This is from Josh Fonsheim. With your experience in agencies and now working with a sole brand, have you ever worked with in-house creative? And if so, what are the positives, negatives working with in-house creative compared to outsourcing the creative?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's pros and cons to everything. I think, in-house creatives, they're going to really understand the brand. They're going to live and breathe the brand every day. They're going to, keep up with the churn on a daily basis, and know who all the players are, the politics, at what we can do, what we can't do. Um, I think, when you work with agencies, I think you have, the whole black box. I'm going to go away for a couple weeks and come back to, and make a big splash presentation. um, that I don't think those days are over, but I could just speak from my own experience that that isn't as helpful. And we've tried to create models where, also working with, RGA, your alma mater, where they're much more embedded, not as like consultants or anything like that, but really working with our teams. I think we're just as a piece of advice, I think you know, one thing I've always had to balance is the internal creative teams are just as passionate about what they're doing and their work as the agency. And if you give too much to the agency and you turn your in-house creative team into reviewers or strategists, or that sort of role, I find, they want to get their hands dirty, they want to roll up their sleeves, they want to create. So I think, if there's no right or wrong answer, but I think hybrid models have worked for us, and balancing, um, the that creative opportunity is the tricky part. But if you can make it work, the work is great.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer, and it's really in line with what we've been hearing across different in-house teams we work with, and different marketing teams and creative teams that have external agency partners or hybrid models. Um, uh, Once you're inside, it's almost like the briefing process that goes on within an agency, right? It's this really extensive process. Inside, the brief can be really quick. You can see what the opportunity is. You know that range, like you're talking about. You know how to actually get it done, and there's that chance to move faster and execute quicker and learn faster. But if you're trying to get outside of that range, that's where really an external agency can really help push to something you hadn't thought of.
Yes.